Hey folks, welcome back to the Net podcast. We are your guides on this unicorn networking tour for when your sysadmin walks into your office or into your virtual room and tells you they're taking over networking, and what are you going to do about it? We've got the dog pound here. I'm going to call you guys the dog pound. Pretty cool.
I'm not barking, no matter how much. I'm sorry.
I'm from the mouse pound.
Yeah, the mouse pound. We were gonna have Tom live stream his bowling team, but social distancing has prevented that. So we've got one of my favorite.
We've got.
Yeah. We've got one of my favorite storytellers of all time, John Willis, here with us. I've known John a long time. John is a salt of the earth guy that has, I would consider you at least an uncle of DevOps, if not a parent. I think as networking has moved along down the path of automation, and we've obviously been adopting a lot of the DevOps concept. So having John on to talk about the history of DevOps and what he sees in the future of DevOps makes a lot of sense to us. So with that, John, what's up, man?
Rock and roll, man. It's funny. I was just talking to Patrick this morning, Patrick the bar, right? So the running joke is people will say, somebody will introduce me as the godfather of DevOps, and I'll say, no. I'm the consigliere. Patrick is the godfather. So yeah, that's how that goes. Yeah, I just got lucky at the right time. I was at Chef, and this thing was kicking off. Actually, I was Canonical, to be honest with you. I was at Canonical, and I was an advisor to Chef, and I saw, I had heard, actually Andrew Clay Schaefer, who now is my boss, talk on a podcast about this agile infrastructure or agile operations. So I literally almost drove off the road because I was like I didn't think agile was me, but when you put the word agile and operations or agile and infrastructure together, I'm like, that's me, right? And I called him up and I said, well, what is this? I need to know more. Feed me. And he said, well, there's some guy in Europe that's driving. I tracked down Patrick, and in fact, what I did, which was time I was working for Simon Wardley at Canonical, and so Patrick said, well, if you get Canonical to send you over here and pay your expenses, we'll give Canonical a sponsorship. So and Simon is like, I don't know, what's this DevOps? How do you spell it? And I'm like, dude, this is gonna be huge. This is there's no doubt in my mind that's from the first time I heard the concept to the word. And he did, and I went there, and I just saw, this whole it was a renaissance, really. I mean, I'd been doing Tivoli stuff for quite a while, right? And it just seemed like, I was at a crossroad in my career. Do I really help people? These large mammoth frameworks, you come in, it just felt not right? A company spend ridiculous amount of money on a ton of software. And although I had a consulting company that actually came in after the big guys failed for a couple of years and sort of made the best of the bad situation, but it was just depressing. And all of a sudden these young kids are talking about open source projects and, and monitoring with behavior-driven development and just all sorts of stuff. And I came back to the U.S. and I was, we've got to do something here. And we started the first DevOps days in the U.S. and it sort of, that sort of launched the whole, U.S. We had big conference. Actually, our first conference was tied to Velocity, O'Reilly's Velocity. We ran a 2-day DevOps day on the tail end of O'Reilly's Velocity. And the beauty was everybody who was somebody in sort of that emerging conversation that hadn't been codified at DevOps yet was at Velocity. So they all just stayed. So all these sort of leaders in the, Luke Canice from Puppet, Adam Jacob from Chef, Jesse Robbins, Theo Schlotzner, all these guys that were sort of really instrumental in a lot of the things that were happening in monitoring configuration management.
Well, I
And
remember at
yeah,
the
so that
time
that
it
sort of
was,
drove the whole, that sort of emerging process.
but
That was
remember
cool.
at the time, John, you were saying how it was like I remember feeling kind of the same way the way you described, like it was this, oh wow, somebody kind of figured this out. Like, remember, like rewind back to where we were. I mean, we were talking about like using Tickle and expect scripts and that kind of stuff, and we were like in this transition of NetOps automation. I mean, I think I was at BT when this stuff started to happen, and we were looking at this, and I was going, oh wow, like you're saying, finally, not like yet another framework of whatever,
Yeah.
but
Well,
like a better way to do this.
well, what's funny though, like, so that whole thing happened, right? Like, so, I mean, you could say let's say that the first DevOps day in Ghent, the one I went to, right? So I was the only American there. That was because, Simon Woodley from Canonical paid my way. And, the next year, the next sort of 8 months later, we had a big U.S. conference, in Silicon Valley and Mountain View, Piggyback Velocity. And then for the next couple of years, we'd have one in Europe, one in the U.S., one in Europe, one. The joke would be like wherever Patrick wanted a vacation is where we have it in Europe. Um, but then, then it just broke out like all the different cities. But what's funny is the two things that really never came up or didn't come up like or enough to catch anybody's radar were security and networking, right? So we were very myopic on the infrastructure as code, Chef, Puppet, eventually Ansible, and but it wasn't for me personally. This is the kind of story I've told many times how I met Brent. I really wasn't. I would say I'm not a security person. I'm not a network person, but I've been doing enough sort of sysadmin work that like you absorb a reasonable amount of those skills over time, right? And I remember going to this analyst conference. I'd go every year, and it would be in Vail, and they'd pick you up at the airport in a van, and they'd share a ride. And there was this young knucklehead kid on his laptop coding, just coding like crazy coding. He had like Eclipse up and an IE, and finally after about an hour, it's usually like 2, maybe 3, sometimes 4 hour drive. He came up for air, and I'm like, hey, what do you do? And it's like, I was telling him about DevOps, and he says, yeah, I'm a network guy. I'm like, no, you're not a network guy. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, you're coding Java, you're in Eclipse. Like, network people don't do that. And then he filled me in about like sort of software defined networking and all this stuff. And that it was perfect timing again. Like even the sort of I was fed up back in like 2009. We were like maybe 2013 or I don't know 14 or something like that. I was also thinking I don't really want to talk about like cloud or CI/CD. Again, it's like, and then all of a sudden I met Brent, and I got this whole insight to this emerging opportunity of DevOps overlaid on top of networking. And but I do remember one funny thing. Jerry Schulman, right? Like he warned me because I was so the thing was to me it was in the early days of Chef, even pre sort of infrastructure as code. I remember going to some of the staunchy Linux meetups, right? Like up in Boston, right? And almost like getting chased down the street with pitchforks for suggesting
Yeah,
that you
heretic.
could automate installing infrastructure. Like, how dare you? What's going to happen? What if it wakes up and breaks everything? Well, it
Yeah.
doesn't do that.
Yeah, it was
And
very much like this heretical thing because, like I was saying, like the NetOps community there was still a lot of inertia in the, we're just going to automate this with shell scripts and that kind of crap, right? And, Brent, you saw this, right? That's why you were off, you were in a very small place too. This was a necessity. You didn't do this because it was necessarily just fun thing to do. It was like, I think a lot of people at the time were realizing like, shit, this is the way I need to make this thing scale. Like if I've got a network that's operated by 2 people and it's a certain size, there's only so many hours in the day, and
what was
Yeah,
funny though is
but just to zero in really quick on John's point on, so Tom's exactly right. Like you come to this out of necessity because I mean, so you don't have any other choice because you're strapped with resources. You know, you're already burning the candle on both ends. So like, why not automate it? But like getting that cross pollination from somebody, you know, from the system side. Like instead of us reinventing the wheel in NetOps, it's like, you know, and talking to John for 5 minutes, you know, 10 years ago.
That was the thing that got me
God.
excited, like that, because I thought, oh my God, this is a redo.
Yeah.
Like, after I met you, Brent, I started like going to these conferences and talking to like these guys who were doing. But at the time, OpenStack was the big deal, right? And I remember talking to some guy and like watching like all these like eight egress points to get off the host, and I'm like, and oh my God, like this is a redo, like Chef or something for networking and all this stuff. And I go up to this one guy, he's teaching this workshop, right? And he's an old timer networking. And he's like, well, I'd be really concerned about something. Network is not like systems, and it just, I'm like, boy, I just go back 6 years. This is the guy who was telling me that you couldn't do that to a system because, if you bring down a core system, you're this, funny stuff that you're talking about. So I'm all excited thinking, oh my God, like these, and then I start running to people saying, oh, it's going to be hard, John. I'm like, oh no. Like, you just trust me. I've done this
hard
before.
is not a
and
reason
Jerry
not to
Sullivan
do
who
it.
told me, like,
It's
it
like,
ain't going to happen. And
Yeah.
what was funny, we ran a DevOps for networking day, and we had a panel, and Jerry asked the audience, like, how many people code? It was like 150 people that showed up, almost all networking people. You remember that, Brent? It was when we started Socket Play. And it was just it was like a Wednesday where 150 people, network people, showed up, like, all right, DevOps and network. They were excited. And he asked, how many people code? Like 3 people raised a hand. And then he said, how many people want to code? And only the 3 people had their hand up. I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
maybe you're right, Jeremy. This might be a little harder than I thought, so.
This was endemic of the whole state of the universe. That's what I was saying. Like, I had the same thing. I was doing ODL around then, right? And we had the same thing. Like, we sat down I still remember with a bunch of customers, like doing a tutorial thing, and I had the same reaction you did, John. I said, how many people here can code? And there were like 5 people and then I said, how many people do Java? 0.
Yeah.
And those 5 people were like COBOL.
The killer was nobody wanted to code.
Nobody
right?
wanted to code,
like, oh,
yeah.
okay, now I get it, right?
Yeah, it was
like,
this transition, right? Like NetOps was really getting the network folks to realize that the whole thing is a system and is programmatic. You can program the whole thing, but you got to, and this is like the changes that we were making.
Yeah, this was exactly it, right? I mean, all of these things, I think we discussed on a previous podcast. So in about 10 years ago, when we were doing the N1K, which was one of the early SDN things, right? And we did that, and we would come out and we would talk about things like, well, no one should care about this networking, and we've got to make it so it's kind of invisible, and it should just work. And people would be like, kind of like the same thing John said. They'd be like, wait a sec, what? That's my job, is like going and doing that stuff. And we said, well, there's other jobs, right? But then fast forward from there, and in 2013, I was given this internal talk to a bunch of Cisco sales engineers where I was basically telling them, and this is 7 years ago, remember, and I was telling them, you're going to have to convert, you're going to have to become a programmer, you're going to have to start to use, infrastructure as code in terms of.
Yeah, remember you and I had the same sort of like compared notes. I did the same thing.
Yeah.
I stood in front of all this SEs at Brocade, and I was like, you all are going to have to learn how to code in Python at least, and learn. It was.
One more sort of story was, in Etsy, I'd known John Osborne and those guys pretty well, and I thought, and they were post-account NetOps, right? Like, I'm like, John, can I talk to your network people? Like, they're gonna this is gonna be glorious. This is gonna be my blueprint for like tell the Etsy network story. And they warned me, a couple of the guys that work for John said, yeah, you're probably not gonna find what you think you're gonna find. I get a guy and he's like top of rack, man. I mean, he's like, all in Cisco and don't muck with anything here. And like, they were about as classic staunchy network guy as you could, get from your sort of Wall Street bank, right? And but here's the interesting thing, right? And again, I got to give credit to Jeremy Shulman again, because he's the one that sort of tapped me into this. The idea that you put some network people in the room and you sort of all right, you're going to have to learn this thing called Git. This is horrible. Why do I got to do this? This is terrible. This is terrible. But then the next thing you do is you show them a template, and then some, so templating software, some Python templating, right? And so you show them a peering exercise, right? And and then you show them how like you can create variables, and then you're like, oh yeah, now I think that that really stuff I hated about learning Git now makes sense. Doing appearing on a pull request and that like, oh my goodness, I'm not going to have to cut and paste stuff. And I did actually that sort of stuff got people, sort of classic network people, because they'd recognize. The other thing is you can't tell people, like if you tell somebody like you're going to like this, you're going to do this, right? You have to sort of draw them in. Right.
You have to bring them along for the adventure.
Like they found the things, you tell them like you're going to like using a software control system because, or they can sort of, situationalize the like, oh man, like having an extra set of eyes here is just a brilliant idea. Like on
that's really the trick, is that showing people that it's not necessarily a revolutionary thing. It's a revolutionary kind of concept, but practically speaking, coding in Python, that's why Python for me has been the most accepted by the NetOps community, because it's a combination effectively of, it's a programming language, but it's kind of like a scripting language almost, right? You can look at it, it's interpreted like a script, and that's how I kind of got a bunch of folks that were, SE types to come start exploring the new stuff, because I said it's not that different,
So let me ask you. I mean, I don't want to make it look like like if I'm not evangelizing stuff doesn't happen. But it seemed that like as we were doing socket playing and like before we decided to sell the Docker, right? Like my mission was just going to be destroy the world with this networking DevOps story, right? And we got acquired, and then sort of Docker changed a lot of our momentum. But it just seems that, we got acquired in like 2014. There was this emergent discussion, and then it hasn't seemed to really flourish a lot, right? Like I know there's, sort of some workshop stuff, but it seems like we would have had a stronger conversation. And, following Brent, Brent's been my mentor on a lot of this stuff. It seems maybe that sort of the SDN bubble maybe got in the way of that, or I don't know why, or do you guys see it differently, that it has been progressing?
It was definitely a couple of things going on at the same time, and the SDN thing, it took us a while to figure out really what it was. To be honest, right? We fished around in the dark for a bunch of stuff, but really at the end of the day, today it boils down to programmatic control of, like what what Kyle was saying, like of network pieces parts. And it's not that, and here's a lesson that we keep learning repeatedly. We did this in OpenStack and again in Kubernetes. We've seen the movie too, which is there's a certain fantasy that you can forget about the network. What you really want to do is you want to make it controllable in an easy and programmatic way. It's always got to be there. Like that's the reality. It's just you got to make it programmatic so that you can manipulate and use it. And if you do want to forget about it, there's a default that's reasonable. You don't have to do a lot of futzing around. But really, like that programmatic piece, Kyle, this is the thing. Like we were talking with Dave at Cisco for a long time about. This was, for me before I worked on SDN, this is what it was. It was called programmatic. Programmatic control or whatever we were calling it at the time. And really it was like, let's stick APIs on everything so I can talk to it with Python. Like, like that's where like 1PK kind of started at Cisco and some of the other API projects. And so John, see, like there's two ends to this equation. Like you can have fully automated programmatic, automation to go do things, but if you don't have the touch points on the other side, you're SOL, right? So we were kind of working on this from both sides of the candle here,
Well, what is it? It's one of the things that I remember. I went to an ONUG, and then there was that woman who had frenetic, right? She had that sort of that language that could
Oh yeah, that was
program.
Jennifer Rexford.
Oh,
Yeah,
JRex,
could
yeah.
program flow tables, right? And
Yeah.
I think Brent hit under the table when I asked this question. I said, well, shoot, why can't you just chef the hell out of that, And like she tried to explain it to the sort of the novice, and then I think Brent pulled me aside a little bit, like, don't hang around me if you're going to ask questions. No, he didn't say that. No, but he gave me and then over time I got to understand a little bit the complexity of how OpenFlow and how that worked, and like the idea of that you could just handle all the exotic edge cases.
But you see the linkage though. You couldn't handle those things without this programmatic piece in the front.
Right.
Like you can't even talk to it, right? I mean, that's one of the shticks that OpenFlow came out with, which is you got to have external control that is not via a CLI or a SNMP interface or whatever at the time.
Yeah, it's like OpenFlow started that conversation, but I think the entire industry realized, you're not gonna solve this problem with OpenFlow, but it kind of
It opened
what
the door,
it opened
though.
up exactly, right? So then they realized, well, wait,
Let's
what
think
if we
about
had
this now.
programmatic control of some of these existing concepts? Maybe who knows if that's the end game, but at least it moves the conversation forward. And it turns out there was a lot of value in that, and so that's what a lot of the.
Let me give you an example of this,
came from.
of how this, John, like how this failed and then how it's working now.
Okay, that'd be awesome. Yeah.
When I was at Cisco way back when, near the end before I left Cisco around 2007, we were discussing route servers, so offline route computation, which is very common today, right? All the web scale people do it, and all that. And I distinctly remember having conversations with our engineering folks, the best engineering folks at Cisco, saying, this is an insane idea. This will never scale. It won't work right. You can't do it fast enough. You know what I mean? All that kind of stuff. Fast forward, that thing is now called PCE, right? And a real intrinsic fundamental piece of that is the programmability of it, right? It's the feedback loop that it becomes, and lets you do stuff. And whether you're automating testing or config or whatever, and you can see how like it's a different thing, but it's the same concept, but it's a different way of thinking about it now. Now that people go, oh yeah, I have enough compute horsepower and the network's fast enough, and now this stuff is plausible, But the key piece of that, one of the key pieces was programmability. If you can't talk to the thing,
So to summarize what you guys are saying is that, the original SDN promise, I think, as a community, we drank too much Kool-Aid, right? Like, we're going to segment database calls. But the truth is, you needed that sort of opening door to at least expose programmability so that then you can find the things that actually fit more naturally to network.
Correct. That was the key, to slowly pry open the door on those boxes.
Right. I get that's brilliant. Yeah.
This
what about,
SNMP and CLI.
So this is where I started for you guys.
In retrospect,
I
in
thought that,
retrospect, John,
another
though,
thing
you
that
were
I
right.
thought, and maybe my head's not in the space enough, but I thought the Aristo original promise, Cumulus, and going down that path of short, really sysadmin, really, Cumulus went all the way in, right, all in. It was just a network operating system that was just basically, I don't know if it was CentOS, I don't remember what it was, but Aristo had a little bit of both, but I thought that was a space. Is that still? I don't ever hear about Cumulus anywhere. That seemed sort of a place that would have grown, especially when you talk about like.
I think it did. I think it definitely did, and I think, but I think what happened with Cumulus was they did all that awesome work on the Linux kernel because they basically said, 7 years ago, they said we're going to take Linux. That's going to be the network operating system, right? It's no different than a host, right? So they're like, it's just a specialized host with a super expensive switch ASIC that exposes all these ports. So they did all that work in the kernel, and it was great. And what they maybe inadvertently did was they just made Linux networking itself better, and they made it better on the host. So to some extent, I think they wanted to make this switch more of a central type of thing, but running Linux. But really, by making the Linux networking better, they made Linux on any host.
Yeah,
They wanted to make a host be treated like, sort of like you're saying at the beginning, John, just another part of the system.
Yeah.
By the way, Brent, Kyle, look behind you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Look behind you, Kyle, for Cumulus.
I know. I was wondering if anyone was going to notice that the rocket turtle.
No, I remember early GitHub days. I had a buddy over there, and so I talked to him about it. So I started calling all my sort of buddies at these DevOps shops. So it was funny. The guy over there ran like operations and infrastructure, and he said, "Yeah, no, we're running all Cumulus." And so he goes, "You know what? Maybe next year we'll actually hire a network person." Like they were so like they were sort of
really need to. It
brilliantly
was just,
naive about networking that it hadn't bubbled up until like somewhere around that time that we probably should get a real network person because we're just a bunch of sysadmins, but we've been using. And I thought that was pretty cool, right?
But you mentioned Aristo, right? So the story, the story about Aristo, right? Bill Fenner started Aristo, but Bill Fenner was in ops in AT&T. And he was kind of after the same thing, John. I want stuff I can configure and program.
Yeah, I know.
And automate.
For me,
and
it was awesome.
Wasn't getting love from the other guys.
The one thing I loved about Aristo was I could look at every command and it was a Python.
Yes.
Code, right? Like talk about like learn. It's funny for me. Like even like Chef. Like I was a sysadmin with like large frameworks and all. And then I wasn't like doing sort of the where you manage like thousands of servers and stuff like. I was really more in bringing in large frameworks like Tivoli and working almost exclusively on Solaris. But I get to Chef and like I learned like crash course on everything because there was a cookbook. Like if I wanted to know how to do like any mod with Apache, right? There was a cookbook for a mod, right? Like, so I had this, like, my first 6 months at Chef, I basically became this, like, incredible super sysadmin because I just had to look. And it was the thing I liked about Arista, too, was that same thing. Like, I could go open up any of those Python commands, at least get a general sense of, like, what was going on, what was supposed to come back from the output.
I always tell people, like, Arista's devices are what you get when you have an operator design a device.
Yeah, that's cool.
That's really, Fenner and crew have done a really good job with that thing.
Well, here's my $1,000,000 question. I got a $1 million question. Go ahead.
Let
me throw one thing at you. So I think you were I think you were right originally, right? And we were wrong in the sense that you're like, well, shouldn't this just be Chef, Puppet, eventually Ansible? That's what we should have been doing, to be honest, right? So if we fast forward to now, so SDN went through the trough of disillusionment.
Right.
Kubernetes has driven the practical adoption of those low-level constructs and low-level APIs for programmability for a data plane or a control plane. A lot of that is being gobbled up into
This is a good setup for my next question, by the way. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
But what networking didn't, so it's kind of the argument Martine mentioned in the podcast we had, where it's like networking might not be the right people to evolve this. They might be the right people to operate it.
Yeah,
we might not be the right people to.
Well, because they'll come up with the network hammer and everything is a network nail, right?
I mean, that was the GitHub, right?
Like
that was the sort of they were so naive that they didn't. Yeah. Well. This is, Brett, you've heard me ask me, Tom, we even had a conversation about this, but I'd love to get, if you had any updated thoughts, but I would love to hear Kyle's deal. So, again, not being the network guy, it was something interesting that so as we were starting to talk about service mesh and Istio and Envoy, right, like all that stuff, right, I knew enough about, Brent like baptized me in sort of layer 3 and like all this stuff, right? So I have, again, not an expert, but certainly have a good understanding of what you do there. And certainly when we talk about like OpenFlow and stuff like that, right? Being able to do things. So then I start hearing about like the Istio Envoy and then Google says that this will scale at Google scale. And I'm like, that's layer 7, man. I like my limited brain of like, I just don't see how you'll be able to scale to like, sort of real scale. And then I talked to some guy at Google, right? Like, and he said, yeah, well, there's really not a whole lot. There's a little bit of sort of missing truth there because we do actually run, we run OpenFlow under the covers. We have NIC offloaders. There's a ton of stuff that to say that we actually can do all this work at layer 7 and scale. Because if you
can do that work at layer 7, but the layer 3 in the network has to support it.
At layer 7 right now.
Yeah.
And I just believe that at some point, maybe enterprises won't hit this necessity of scale, but it seems to me that there's going to be that stuff. Some of that stuff's going to have to be balanced. Does that make sense, Kyle? I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying is that the network has to be able to support that. So, a layer 7 abstraction, which is what like Istio gives you, where you're talking to names, not DNS names even, although that is one idea that we're exploring now, which is like, let's just shove those things into DNS. And then you can do some other cute things with that.
If you're doing traffic routing and you're trying to do sort of identity and you're doing all these things, that at least that was the promise of sort of the original SDN.
Mm-hmm. And it's a similar concept, but you still need layer 3 under it because you got to get from 10 dot whatever dot 10 to dot 11 over there,
But are we being naive to say that we just like these large banks and stuff just to plop in Istio and it all this stuff will work, and if we're not actually addressing that scale at layer 3?
It's about what it will work means, right? And it's that the thing I've learned is none of these things are perfect and they're all contextual, right? So if your goal is to do layer 7 routing and you've got a development organization that's geared towards that kind of thing, or you build apps that way and microservices, then you may not want to deal with any of the low-level stuff. You got to get it set up and.
But would it be a scale issue at that point? Though I guess that's my question.
It's only a scale issue if you don't have more. That's really the issue is. Can you add more? Can you add more horsepower? Because there's a certain amount of overhead that all of these abstractions add on top.
Right.
But there's no free lunch. So you're doing those things to make enough. That's what I was saying is you're doing those things to make a certain part of your life easier. So if your devs only care about that kind of thing, like we do a lot of enterprise development here, and a lot of the larger organizations have devs that, they're sort of like systems engineering, application programmers.
Doesn't it have to be a performance cost of doing sort of, traffic routing at layer 7 versus layer 3?
In some cases, it doesn't matter. That's the thing. Like if you've got a couple of databases, 3 home database,
right,
and it takes you an extra half a second to get to that database, there are applications where they don't care.
Okay.
And that's really the thing. I mean, if you're, this is really like the thing Martine was talking with us about the other day, where network people immediately go to the worst case scenario, and want to make the thing work for the worst case scenario.
Right.
We're going to scale, we're going to, lowest latency, blah, blah, blah. Those things come at a cost, and it's not just a CapEx cost, it's an OpEx cost sometimes, right? Sometimes you got to really over configure things, and it's very complicated, but, you want, sub-second latency, no packet loss because you're doing stock trading or something, right? On the other hand, if you've got an HR database and it takes you 2 seconds to look up your pay stub versus 4 seconds, so
yeah,
what?
No, I get that.
You know what I mean? So that's what I'm saying. Like the question you're asking is true if those things matter, but it's a more complicated question, I think, than just saying this is going to scale to hyperscale or not. If you go look at the hyperscalers, it's kind of like what your source was telling you, is that there's a lot of other stuff going on under the covers to make that work in this nice and seamless way, and comes at a certain cost, but it works. It does work.
Well, cool.
So it's really like that's kind of where a lot of these conversations for me have gotten lost and lose the point, is when people try to focus on, oh, my solution, this whatever thing is the best thing since sliced bread.
Yeah,
None of
no,
them,
I mean
none of
that's
them are,
well, and
right?
what I worry that people get sort of myopic, right? Like they don't like oh, it's sort of binary. Like, oh, I can
Yeah.
do this, fine. Well, to your point, not for all, high frequency or latency sensitive services, right? That you
Yeah.
probably have to invest some of the plumbing. Um,
It's just
yeah,
engineering. I mean, you've got to look at these are like when I look at Kubernetes or OpenStack or whatever, I mean, they're tools.
right.
And does the tool work for what you're trying to do? I mean, that's really we talked back at OpenFlow. OpenFlow was really overblown because it was a solution that was needed to a problem that didn't really exist, which is the
Right.
programmability thing we talked about. But as we all know, it was a bit of a circus for a while, right? About, oh, this is going to be God's gift to networking, et cetera. It wasn't. I mean, it's got a certain use that it's good for. It doesn't solve all the world's problems of networking, though. And that's it's that you see this every time one of these new kind of disruptive technologies comes out. The latest one is 5G, right? And I'm working on this one now, not to kind of change the subject, but I mean, it's just a new version of technology, and it's going to solve a certain kind of set of problems and a certain kind of problem. It's not going to solve all of them. In fact, it may solve all of them, but it's not going to solve all of them in the most optimal way. So it's really a matter of let's get down to do some engineering and analysis and figure out if the thing works or not for what you want to use it for. Like Istio works, but for example, I wouldn't operate remote cars on it, unless you had a certain setup, right?
It's a vehicle to vehicle.
It's all
Yeah,
good
so
to
you know
get
what I mean?
jobs on the
Like,
line for the performance.
yeah, it's just
The
you gotta do the math.
So
so moving forward with like level setting where NetOps is today, there's basically like configuration management back in the day was
right.
looked at like a vial of anthrax. Nobody wanted to touch it. Today, everybody,
Hates us.
any NetOps shop of some scale is going to have it, and it's actually, I think net people are like, hey, this is fun. I can actually do this programmatically. It's dynamic. It's not a spreadsheet I'm having to fill out by hand once a month. And I think, I even did like a while back for a company setting up a POC of storing configs on Git, right? And starting to, here's how infrastructure as code actually works in the real, in the systems world. Here's how we start checking in configurations. Here's how we push them down to boxes. So kind of that infrastructure as a code premise. John, where do you see, like, what was the next evolutionary step in DevOps that you think could apply to NetOps moving forward?
Yeah, I think, I mean, like you would sort of hope that most organizations, we know they're not, would at this point be anything that sort of is config based would be in something like GitHub or GitLab, or right, and would follow the sort of the SDLC process or software supply chain, like the commit, and you got to peer and go through that process. Possibly, a little more robust in terms of automation, like a switch config, maybe be templatized and all that, right? So you would hope that delivery process would be reasonably mature for any artifacts that, that should be, take the human factor out of as much as you can. And then I think, so that's table stakes, right? I think if I think about the things that whether they're platitudes or they're sort of the shiny new thing in DevOps, I mean you can't have a conversation nowadays talking about either SRE, Dojo, or SRE, Dojo, or what was the third one I want? Chaos engineering, right? So I think that's a big leap, but like I don't hear any networking conversations in those three discussions, right? So, I mean, certainly Google, the way they do SRE, they certainly have service level objectives and whole pods not like Kubernetes, but pods of latency, which basically translates into SLIs with latency to SLOs. But a lot of organizations like banks and stuff, I don't see them talking as much on the network side. Like they'll use more of response or sort of some automated, I don't think of the term of the technology, but the things that sort of script into your things and check response times, right? But that's not really looking at network or packet loss or I don't know, whatever would be really important. And then same thing with the dojo. I don't see a whole lot of DevOps DevOps Dojo is I think DevOps Dojo is a brilliant way to transform an organization. And I don't think I've ever seen where they talk about sort of a network team coming into the dojo. Now, it may happen, I just haven't seen it, or that there are sort of network coaches in there so that they could help you on certain things that you might not be aware of for your application. And then, the chaos engineering I think is interesting too, right? Like if you go back to some of the Netflix stuff, right, there is some network latency kind of things, but really exploring how you would, sort of stretch the networking. So again, if we think those are, I'm not saying they're the only things. I have a lot of other thoughts about culture and behavior, as I always do. The Deming,
the chaos engineering thing is one of those other new disruptive things, though, right? I mean, I've been in a number of organizations where, and even today, right, the CI passed, everything's awesome. The chaos thing assumes there's something that's not awesome, and you just haven't found it yet. So keep looking, keep breaking it to keep finding it. And that is you're right, John. I mean, that's a cultural thing as much as a technology thing, and like Netflix was a good example.
That's not status quo even in sort of DevOps, right? Like you have to go in the bank, ooh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Like I like everything else you told me, John, but like that one, like killing live servers, like I don't like that one, but But I'm doing this now on a project we're working on now, where we have introduced that into this is a big 5G project we're doing, and I'm saying, the power does go out every now and then, whether you like it or not. Right. Let's make sure we try it, and so we destroy an entire server cluster, and make sure the automation can bring it back up. And you know what? We found a few times it didn't. Yeah, no, it's the beauty.
But ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is ignorance until you find out. And that is a surprise. And that the chaos kind of approach really is a firm recognition that we haven't tested everything.
Yeah, especially remember Brent? We did that. What was it? The Linux Foundation. We did that. We did a networking day there, and you invited the guy from Facebook. And I always think this is just an amazing story, right? Like he said, I'm going to context switch just for a second. I remember seeing Werner Orgels at, the longtime CTO of Amazon give a presentation back when I was at Chef in Seattle, and somebody was asking at the end of his presentation, like, what do you monitor? And he says, well, kid, we monitor a lot of things. Yeah, he didn't say kid, but like the only thing we really care about is order rate, right? Like that's the thing we have, years of heuristics. We know when it's good. We know when it's bad. On a Wednesday afternoon, it should be between this upper and lower. And then, so I always thought about that. And then the gentleman you invited from Facebook, and he said, basically he said, the only thing we really care about is packet loss. And they triangulated packet loss at like massive scale, and they were able to basically, almost all sins, according to that presentation,
yep.
But
it's interesting. They went from like the user experience, though. That's also a different perspective. Like it's not kind of, we were saying this earlier, like the network people would be looking at the network all the time, and Netflix is selling a service that is video streaming over a network. And that's just one of the constituent dependencies.
Right.
And that's the chaos kind of approach broke it all in a way that helped them realize what you just said,
But introducing packet loss, right? Like to see at what threshold does that actually
see where it blows up. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
But that's my sort of. I think those are. They're the only things. I don't like going into a client saying you need SRE, you need DevOps Dojo, you need chaos engineering. Although in the end, those wind up on the roadmap list, right? So those are, I think, the things that are sort of top of mind of most people who are thinking about, like, what do you do in DevOps today, or what are the things that are sort of working, interesting. So how do you drag network, making sure that network, and you get the whole cloud thing, right, which is sort of, semi-annoying, right? Like, you walk into organizations and they're sort of cloud first from the CEO, and 90% of what they have can't get into the cloud for a number of reasons. And so now you start building up this ridiculous technical debt on things that aren't cloud first. Oh, no, we can't put any resources in it. Yeah, but it's a core service. Like, so
Yeah.
I think that sort of gets in our evolutionary path of networking, right? Like when you start saying, well, if everything's going to cloud anyway, like why do we,
Yep.
Because then it's just really more abstractions of, I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
right,
that's a
because
great
all the
point.
abstractions become cloud native or networking.
Yeah,
cloud
and
networking, and it's a different model, but it does fit into DevOps, right? Because in the cloud, you want to create a network, you create a VPC, and you can do that all programmatically and everything. So it does kind of fit nicely from that.
But then I remember, I'll just name drop. I always had this. I've stopped having this argument with Kelsey about, all right, Kelsey, let me make one more argument. And I'm pro cloud, like I've been pro cloud, so I'm not like an anti-clouder. But I always sort of think about when will there sort of be a whiplash, right? There'll be certain business opportunities where you will get a competitive advantage by having your own hardware or your own and be able to do sort of below the rack telemetry, whatever, right? And so every time I throw a story at him, like, okay, high frequency trading, surely I got you on this one. And he's like, well, John, imagine a cloud provider just getting a block of servers on an exchange and then selling them for a crazy high price. I'm like, oh, you got me again, man. So I don't know,
I love it. Well, John, we're coming to the top of the hour. So I know you finished a book here pretty recently. What was that?
Well, I mean, the DevOps handbook's been out for a while. We're doing a 5-year anniversary of it, so we're going to be updating it. And then I did Beyond the Phoenix Project with Gene Kim, which was a sort of follow-on to the Phoenix Project. And there's about 3 of us working on the DevSecOps handbook, but man, oh man, it's just taken us forever. And so
Writing books takes
I
time, more
hesitate
time than
to
people
actually
think.
say when, collaborative books are really tough. So
Yeah.
Awesome.
yeah, that's pretty much it right now.
Cool. Okay. Congrats on getting another one done, though.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
All right, everybody. Well, we're going to wrap it up here today. John, thanks again for joining us.
No, it's fun, man. I love it. So
yeah, that was great.
Love to do it again.